He left her because she couldn't have children. 19 years later, at a grand gala event, he sees her again, but she's not alone. Standing beside her are 4 young adults, and they share his features. How is this even possible? He has to uncover the truth, and what happens next will change everything.
Hey,
Where are you watching us from today? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. The Grand Monarch Hotel stood tall, gleaming under the city lights, a beacon for the elite gathering for the night's prestigious charity gala. Inside, chandeliers cast golden halos over a sea of tuxedos and flowing gowns, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and aged champagne. Richard Kavanaugh moved through the room with practiced grace, his tailored suit flawless, his posture exuding the quiet authority of a man who had spent decades mastering the art of control. Success weighed on him like an invisible mantle, one he wore effortlessly, yet never without sacrifice. He had built his empire from the ground up, achieved everything he had ever set out to, everything except the one thing he had once wanted most. Tonight should have been like any other. An evening of polite conversation, measured indulgence, obligatory philanthropy. And yet something was different. From the moment he stepped into the ballroom, he felt it, a shift in the atmosphere, a tension settling in his bones before his mind could even grasp its source. And then he saw her, Evelyn Lancaster. His breath caught, his carefully composed exterior cracking for the first time in years. She stood across the room, draped in elegance, a dark sapphire gown sculpting her figure as though time itself had dared not touch her. Her hair, once soft waves he used to run his fingers through on quiet Sunday mornings, was now swept into a sophisticated updo, revealing the delicate curve of her neck. But it was her eyes that truly held him captive. He had spent years trying to erase the memory of how they once looked at him, with love, with longing, with silent questions he had never been brave enough to answer. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass, the crystal threatening to shatter beneath the pressure. 19 years. 19 years since he had walked away, convinced that leaving was the only way to spare them both a lifetime of pain. She could not have children. He had wanted a family. The cruel irony of it still clawed at him in the dead of night. Richard should have turned away. He should have kept his distance, held onto the cold indifference that had shielded him for nearly 2 decades. But then he saw them. 4 young adults. They stood close to Evelyn, their presence an undeniable extension of her, tall, poised, their features hauntingly familiar. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs as his gaze flickered between them, his mind scrambling to piece together a puzzle that should not exist. These weren't just strangers in the crowd. They weren't just Evelyn's companions for the evening. They were hers. And they could have been his. The realization struck him like a blow, sending him stumbling back a step, his world tilting on its axis. Evelyn could not have children. He had built his entire life around that fact, used it as his reason, his excuse to leave. So how, in the name of everything he had ever known, did she now stand before him, with 4 young adults who carried unmistakable traces of her bloodline? His fingers slackened around his glass, and it slipped from his grasp, shattering against the marble floor. The sound barely registered over the roaring in his ears. Heads turned. Eyes flickered in his direction. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. But Richard heard none of it. All he saw was Evelyn. And all he could think was, had he been wrong? Had he walked away from something that had been possible all along? For the first time in 19 years, Richard Kavanaugh felt truly lost. The shards of broken glass glinted at his feet beneath the chandelier's golden glow, yet he barely noticed the mess. Because in that moment, his world had just unraveled. And all that remained was Evelyn, and the 4 figures standing beside her. His heart pounded. His thoughts spiraled, a chaotic storm of disbelief and raw, unfiltered emotion. He forced himself to move, to step forward, but every fiber of his being resisted. Evelyn met his gaze, her expression unreadable. Time had refined her, sculpted her into something even more poised, more untouchable. But beneath the surface, something was different. A quiet strength, a defiance, Had it always been there? Or had he simply been too blind to see it? Richard barely registered the curious gazes of the guests who had stopped to watch, because at this moment, only one thing mattered: the truth. And the truth was about to change everything. The unfolding drama held him captive. All he could see was her and them. When he finally found his voice, it felt foreign, hoarse, uneven. Who are they? Evelyn didn't flinch. She didn't waver under the weight of his scrutiny. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, as if this moment had been inevitable. Her lips parted, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, composed. My children. The words struck him like a hammer. His jaw tightened. His hands curled into fists at his sides.
No.
His mind refused to accept it. This was impossible. No, he exhaled, barely a whisper. That's not. They are my children, Richard. Her voice cut through his denial, firm and unwavering. A cold chill swept through him, not just because of the words themselves, but because of the absolute certainty in her tone. Finality. His gaze darted between the 4 young adults standing beside her. The 2 young men, one slightly taller than the other, bore an eerie resemblance to himself at their age. The 2 women, poised and graceful, carried echoes of Evelyn's features. This couldn't be real. It was an impossibility. A cruel twist of fate. Then the taller young man stepped forward. His gaze was sharp, unwavering. His blonde hair, the cut of his jaw, the piercing blue of his eyes. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. I assume you're Richard Kavanaugh? The young man's voice was even, but beneath it was something unreadable. Richard swallowed hard. Yes. A heavy silence settled between them. A silence filled with lost years, unspoken questions, and truths buried for nearly 2 decades. And then, before he could fully process it, Evelyn turned to the others. This is Noah, Nathan, Olivia, and Emma. Each name hit like a hammer, driving nails into the foundation of everything he had once believed. Richard felt the ground shift beneath him.
How?
How was this even possible? The crisp night air bit against Richard's skin as he stood outside the Grand Monarch Hotel, his mind spinning from the impossible revelation. The city sprawled before him, its lights distant and blurred against the suffocating weight of his thoughts. He needed space.
Air.
Something, anything, to make sense of what had just happened. Evelyn had walked away before he could demand answers. And the 4 of them they had followed, without hesitation, leaving him behind, standing alone in a world that suddenly no longer made sense. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone, pulling it from his pocket. There was only one person he could call. One person who could help him find the truth. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Patrick Morris, came the steady, professional tone of his assistant. Patrick, Richard said, his voice tighter than he intended. I need you to find everything you can on Evelyn Lancaster. Now. A pause. Then, sir, I thought you. Just do it, Richard snapped, his patience stretched thin. Medical records. Legal documents. Anything that can explain this. He exhaled sharply, his pulse racing. She has children, Patrick. 4 of them. Silence. Then, a quiet, knowing breath. I'll get on it, Patrick said. Richard ended the call and clenched his jaw, staring at his reflection in the glass doors of the hotel. The man staring back at him was not the same one who had walked in hours ago. Something was missing.
No.
Something had always been missing. And now, for the first time in 19 years, he might finally understand what it was. The city skyline blurred through the tinted windows of his car as he sat in silence, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his knee. The silence was suffocating, but his mind was too chaotic for words. Again and again, he replayed the night, searching for the missing link. Evelyn had said they were hers. Spoken it with certainty. With finality. But she had been incapable of having children. That was why he had left. That had been the unchangeable truth they had both accepted. So what had changed? The car pulled up to his penthouse, and he stepped out, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the lobby. The concierge nodded in greeting, but Richard barely acknowledged him. He took the elevator up, the tension in his chest tightening with every passing second. Then his phone rang.
Patrick.
"Tell me you have something," Richard demanded. "I do," Patrick said, his voice careful. "And you're not going to believe it." Richard closed his eyes. Nothing could have prepared him for what he was about to hear.